Robin Walker. Welcome to Talk with the Titans.
Thanks for having me onto the show.
Excellent. You know, and you've also studied world history studies or African history studies with Dr. Femi Biko. That's incredible. How was it actually, being under him at that time?
At the time, he was the leading person dealing with black studies in Britain. He has systematized it into courses that he could teach. I studied with him back in the day. Really inspiring, very great man. And big love to Dr. Femi Biko.
Definitely. You know what? There's a famous quote that says that knowledge is power. I personally like, the axiom that the application of knowledge is power. I'd like to know what actually started you on your journey of knowledge of self.
By chance, I happened to live in a household where someone had a copy of Chancellor Williams's book, The Destruction of Black Civilization. The book was originally published in 1971. I promised myself that when I finished university, I would read that book from cover to cover, and this was in 1990. And the book was essentially my first step into black history, into African history, into knowledge of self and kind. From there, I'd have read more and more. I used to work with a jazz musician called Courtney Pine, and he was very keen on Professor Yusuf Ben-Yochanin's book, Africa, Mother of Western Civilization. So that was another must-have book. Then I found out about people like Sheikh Anta Diop, found out about people like Ivan van Sertima, found out about English scholars like Basil Davidson. And from there, it's just been more and more reading, more and more research.
Wow, phenomenal. As well, today, history, a lot of the youth can't actually connect with history. They don't understand the importance of history. So I'd like to know, what is the importance of history and what is history?
History is all knowledge that wasn't acquired now. So everything is history. All knowledge that we have, if it's in book form, if it's in televisual form, it wasn't acquired now, it was acquired at some point in the past, so everything is history. What people narrowly call history is what I call political and diplomatic history. But there's other forms of history too. There's sport history, there's literature history, there's art history, there's architecture history, there's science history, there's mathematics history, there's food history, because all of these subjects is knowledge that was not acquired now, but at some point in the past. So if you look at the way that Europeans teach history, they always start with the Greeks and then the Romans and what they contributed. Then they'll have a gap which they call the Dark Ages. Then they'll have the medieval, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and modern periods. And every subject is taught like that. So if we're talking about PE, or physical education, they'll start with the Greco-Roman period. So the Greeks came up with the marathon, athletics, discus, javelin, and so on. So we start there. Then we get into the Roman thing. What people call in this country wrestling is actually Greco-Roman wrestling. And then once it got to Lancashire, they versioned it and turned it into British catch as catch can, as it was called. And then by the time that gets to America, it's now called freestyle. So it's a Roman innovation. And then essentially every subject is taught like that. So whenever someone studies sport, and they start off with marathon, discus, and athletics and track, that's reinforcing the idea that the ancient Greeks were very clever and very important people. If you do wrestling, you're learning that the ancient Romans were very clever and very important people. And essentially, you are partaking of that ancient tradition when you play the sport today. So most people wouldn't see the link between sports and history, but it's all there, and it's the same in every single subject.
And you've literally catalogued or created a timeline of history within your book, When We Ruled. So I'd like to know, for all of those who actually haven't watched that or read that book itself, what is the starting timeline you start at, and what culture or aspect of culture do you start with?
Okay, when we ruled has about 88,000 years of prehistory. In other words, the very first human culture that we have starts about 88,000 years ago in Central Africa, in what is now Congo, or Zaire as it used to be called. But that wasn't a civilization, that was a culture. And they were engaged in fishing, and we've got the fish hooks that still survive to this day. Moving on, 43,000 years ago, Africans in Swaziland dug the first mines, and the evidence and the mining tools and the metals that they were mining for, archaeologists have recovered this. 37,000 years ago, African women in what is now South Africa were the first to come up with a numerical system to map lunar cycles. And the artifact that scholars have found is called the Lebombo bone. Moving on, 25,000 years ago, Africans in what is now, again, Congo or Zaire, whatever, came up with something called the Ishango bone. And it's got markings on it. And scholars say that the markings show base 10, which is the numerical system that we use now, base 12, another numerical system, and it also shows evidence of subtraction, addition, multiplication. Moving on 15,000 years ago, Africans in Kenya, in the Lukenya Hill districts, were the first to do animal husbandry. 12,000 years ago, Africans in Nubia, at a place called Wadi Kubanya, were the first to do agriculture. Moving on now to 8,000 years ago, Africans in Nubia were the first to build a civilized state, and this was the kingdom of Tarseti. Moving on 7,600 years ago, the ancient Egyptians were now the next civilized state, and they were the people that produced a lot of the culture that we practice today. A lot of high school maths is based on an ancient Egyptian document called the Rhine Mathematical Papyrus. You can also show a lot of the religious ideas that we have now is coming from an Egyptian temple built in the 5th dynasty era. The temple is the pyramid of Pharaoh Unas, and so the writings on that wall is what scholars now call the pyramid texts. And so we can then trace, and then we don't just have an ancient history in Africa, there's a medieval history in West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. And my research in writing When We Ruled is to try and put all that together in ways that is makes sense to a modern reader.
Definitely. And I quite recently, I believe it was last year or a year and a half ago, I think I purchased one of your most recent books. The title actually slips my mind right now, but it's to do with religion. And could you remind me of the title?
There's two books. There's one called Blacks and Religion, Volume 1, and there's another one called Blacks and Religion, Volume 2. And what the Volume 1 is what did Africa contribute to the origin and evolution of religion? What African ideas can we specifically trace? And another essay in the same book was to help people understand the Book of the Dead. Some people don't like that title, they prefer Peret em Heru or Coming Forth by Day, whatever. But so that people get a handle on what is actually in that book. And then the Volume 2 was me tracing what role, what impact did Africa have in the origin and evolution of Judaism, in the origin and evolution of Christianity, in the origin and evolution of Islam, the origin and evolution of what people call the Indian religions, and what role did black people have in the origin and evolution of the new religious movements that evolved in the 20th century, such as Jah Rastafari, black liberation theology, the Nation of Islam, and so on.
And if we would like to purchase those books, where can we actually find those books and make those purchases?
Some of the stuff is Amazon. Some of my books are available on Amazon. When We Ruled specifically is available on a website called whenweruled.com. It's not available on Amazon. whenweruled.com.
Great. I really liked the way you broke down the evolution of religious ideas from totemism to animism, etc., etc., etc. Could you give us like a timeline of how the human mind evolved to create different forms of worship?
Up to a point, there's a lot of guesswork involved because we are dealing with a time period before there's written documentation. And it's not really my research, it was a gentleman, Professor Charles S. Finch. So essentially I read his stuff and thought, yeah, I can use that, so I'm going to grab that and run with it. So I have to big up Professor Charles Finch. Okay, the idea is very, very simple. When we look at ancient Egyptian deities, a lot of them have got animal heads, a lot of them are animals. And so that led some of the earlier scholars, like the very great Gerald Massey, to assume that the very first imagery that human beings came up with of the divine force or forces wasn't as human beings, that came later, but was originally as animals. And these animals the scholars call zootypes. And it seems that the ancient Egyptians, in having animal and animal-headed deities, were preserving this even older idea from inner Africa. Now, human beings as we are today have been around for 200,000 years. Civilization as we have it today has been around for 8,000 years. So at some point between 200,000 years and 8,000 years, and we don't know at which point human beings came up with these early ideas of representing the divine force or forces using animals to do it, and the ancient Egyptians preserved the idea. One of the oldest images is possibly of a deity called Ta-Urt. That's the name the Egyptians gave it. We don't know what names people in Central Africa gave it. And it was a pregnant hippopotamus. And why was she pregnant? She was giving life. So essentially early humans used that as a symbol to represent the creation of life. And then from there we get female deities, some taken from nature, the cow being one, the tree was considered female. And then once people worked out the relationship between the lunar cycle and the menstrual cycle being approximately the same length, that's where we start seeing the moon being associated with being a female and representative of a female divine power. Now we know that there is the artifact that was found in southern Africa called the Lebombo bone, and the Lebombo bone is 37,000 years old, and it's a lunar cycle, so it must be 37,000 years ago that at least the Africans worked out the link between the menstrual cycle and lunar cycle. So that's where we start getting lunar deities, and they're female. At a later point, we start seeing male deities, and male deities tend to be associated more with the sun rather than the moon. There are exceptions, of course, but they are more associated with the sun. And then we get the divine space represented as male and female deities. And then we get the notion of the Holy Trinity, the male, the female, and the child. And then by the time we get to the first government in history, which is the Nubian kingdom of Tarseti, the world's first government, we know that some of the deities that we think of as Egyptian, such as Osiris, was worshipped during this period. And there's an artifact that was found in ancient Nubia, which was associated with the Hebsed festival. And the Hebsed festival was the king being associated with Osiris. So we know Osiris was in this ancient kingdom of Nubia. And then by the time we get to the Egyptian period, by the time we get to the 5th dynasty, we now have the world's first religious text, which is the inside of Pharaoh Unis's pyramid. And then they continue to write these texts. They call them the pyramid texts, and then the same literature was written on the sides of coffins, so scholars call them the coffin texts. And by the time we get to the 13th ruling dynasty period of ancient Egypt, they start writing these as manuscripts, or the precursor to manuscripts, or papyri, and burying them with people, and that's when they start to be called the Book of the Dead. And when people started reading these, they found that they all had the same title, Peret en Heru, which then becomes Coming Forth by Day. So that's your first religious book, if you like, And then later religions take and borrow and influence and so on, so on and so forth to create the religions that we have today.
Okay. So would you say that the biblical deity Yahweh, that Hebrew or Judaism paradigm may have possibly borrowed from the earlier Kemetic or Egyptian/Nubian theology and mythology?
Yeah, there's definitely evidence of this. According to mainstream Judaism, the person that laid out halacha is Judaic law, is an Egyptian called Moses. Now, there's a lot of controversy about this because some scholars have debated, did this person even exist? And that discussion has gone backwards and forwards. And there are conservative rabbis in the United States who doubt his existence. They've also put doubt on Abraham and many of the other figures. And that discussion has continued. Then you have the fact that historians in the Greco-Roman period do mention Moses, but they don't mention him being anything to do with Judaism. They just say he's an Egyptian rebel priest. And that discussion has happened. Now, if Moses was an Egyptian and borrowed from Egyptian religious ideas, we should be able to prove that. And we can, because if we look at some of the commandments or mitzvot in Judaism, some of them do look suspiciously like chapter 125 of the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. So that would be one example where we can see this was influenced or borrowed to become this. Then scholars have looked at some other ancient Egyptian texts. There's a text associated with Pharaoh Akhenaten called the Great Hymn to Aten, the Great Hymn to the Sun. And many people have looked at that and have seen, wait a minute, this appears to be word for word Psalms 104 in the Hebrew Tanakh or Bible, whatever. And similar enough there are plenty of websites that have gone there. Then you have bits of Proverbs 22 and Proverbs 23 in the Hebrew Tanakh, which looks just like the book of Amenemope, which is an ancient Egyptian text. Again, a lot of it would appear to be word for word. Then you have the 10 plagues story in the Tanakh, which appears to be the admonitions of Ipuwa, which is an ancient Egyptian text written during the first intermediate period. So a lot of people have gone there and they have seen these kinds of similarities.
Okay. And in terms of the religious aspect, a lot of people kind of put forward the thought that these mythologies are not necessarily, or these deities are not necessarily actual deities as we perceive deities today, but rather scientific principles inside of nature. Do you have any thoughts on that, basically?
I don't have any thoughts on that. I've seen some people say that the term nature looks a little bit like the English word nature, and some people have gone there. But the main problem is that you can't really take an ancient Egyptian word and put it into English, because English didn't exist during that time period. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, whether or not they're scientific principles, it's an area that I think should be investigated. I think research, should be done into it. But me personally, I don't have any opinion one way or the other on that.
And